from G.K. Chesterton's favorite Father Brown stories. Today, we'll continue with part 2 of The Sins of Prince Saradine. Pretty and unique as it was, the place had about it a curious, luminous sadness. Hours passed in it like days. The long, well-windowed rooms were full of daylight, but it seemed a dead daylight. And through all other incidental noises, the sound of talk, the clink of glasses, or the passing feet of servants, they could hear on all sides of the house the melancholy noise of the river. "We've taken a wrong turning and come to a wrong place," said Father Brown, looking out of the window at the gray-green sedges and the silver flood. "Never mind. One can sometimes do good by being the right person in the wrong place." Father Brown, though commonly a silent, was an oddly sympathetic little man, and in those few but endless hours he unconsciously sank deeper into the secrets of Reed House than his professional friend. He had that knack of friendly silence which is so essential to gossip, and saying scarcely a word, he probably obtained from his new acquaintances all that in any case they would have told. The butler, indeed, was naturally uncommunicative. He betrayed a sullen and almost animal affection for his master, who, he said, had been very badly treated. The chief offender seemed to be His Highness's brother, whose name alone would lengthen the old man's lantern jaw and pucker his parrot nose into a sneer. Captain Stephen was a ne'er-do-well, apparently, and had drained his benevolent brother of hundreds and thousands, forced him to fly from the fashionable life and live quietly in this retreat. That was all Paul the butler would say, and Paul was obviously a partisan. The Italian housekeeper was somewhat more communicative, being, as Brown fancied, somewhat less content. Her tone about her master was faintly acid, though not without a certain awe. Flambeau and his friend were standing in the room of the looking-glasses, examining the red sketch of the two boys, when the housekeeper swept in swiftly on some domestic errand. It was a peculiarity of this glittering glass-paneled place that anyone entering was reflected in 4 or 5 mirrors at once. And Father Brown, without turning round, stopped in the middle of a sentence of family criticism. But Flambeau, who had his face close up to the picture, was already saying in a loud voice, "The brothers Saradine, I suppose. They both look innocent enough. It would be hard to say which is the good brother and which is the bad." Then, realizing the lady's presence, he turned the conversation with some triviality and strolled out into the garden. But Father Brown still gazed steadily at the red crayon sketch, and Mrs. Anthony still gazed steadily at Father Brown. She had large and tragic brown eyes, and her olive face glowed darkly with a curious and painful wonder, as of one doubtful of a stranger's identity or purpose. Whether the little priest's coat and creed touched some southern memories of confession, or whether she fancied he knew more than he did, she said to him in a low voice, as to a fellow plotter, "He's right enough in one way, your friend. He says it would be hard to pick out the good and bad brothers. Oh, it would be hard. It would be mighty hard to pick out the good one." "I don't understand you," said Father Brown, and began to move away. The woman took a step nearer, with thunderous brows and a sort of savage stoop, like a bull lowering his horn. "There isn't a good one," she hissed. "There was badness enough in the captain taking all that money, but I don't think there was much goodness in the prince giving it. The captain's not the only man with something against him." A light dawned on the cleric's averted face, and his mouth formed silently the word blackmail. Even as he did so, the woman turned an abrupt white face over her shoulder and almost fell. The door had opened soundlessly, and the pale Paul stood like a ghost in the doorway. But the weird trick of the reflecting walls, it seemed as if 5 Pauls had entered by 5 doors simultaneously. "His Highness," he says, "has just arrived." In the same flash, the figure of a man had passed outside the first window, crossing the sunlit pane like a lighted stage. An instant later, he passed at the second window, and the many mirrors repainted in successive frames the same eagle profile and marching figure. He was erect and alert, but his hair was white and his complexion of an odd ivory yellow. He had that short, curved Roman nose, which generally goes with long, lean cheeks and chin, but these were partly masked by mustache and imperial. The mustache was much darker than the beard, giving an effect slightly theatrical, and he was dressed up to the same dashing part, having a white top hat, an orchid in his coat, a yellow waistcoat, and yellow gloves, which he flapped and swung as he walked. When he came round to the front door, they heard the stiff Paul open it, and heard the new arrival say cheerfully, "Well, you see I've come." The stiff Mr. Paul bowed and answered in his inaudible manner. For a few minutes their conversation could not be heard. Then the butler said, "Everything is at your disposal," and the glove-flapping Prince Saradine came gaily into the room to greet them. They beheld once more that spectral scene, 5 princes entering a room with 5 doors. The prince put the white hat and yellow gloves on the table and offered his hand quite cordially. "Delighted to see you here, Mr. Flambeau," he said. "Know you very well by reputation, if that's not an indiscreet remark." "Not at all," answered Flambeau, laughing. "I'm not sensitive. Very few reputations are gained by unsullied virtue." The prince flashed a sharp look at him to see if the retort had any personal point. Then he laughed also, and offered chairs to everyone, including himself. "Pleasant little place this, I think," he said with a detached air. "Not much to do, I fear, but the fishing is really good." The priest, who was staring at him with the grave stare of a baby, was haunted by some fancy that escaped definition. He looked at the gray, carefully curled hair, yellow-white visage, and slim, somewhat foppish figure. These were not unnatural, though perhaps a shade pronounced, like the outfit of a figure behind the footlights. The nameless interest lay in something else, in the very framework of the face. Brown was tormented with a half-memory of having seen it somewhere before. The man looked like some old friend of his dressed up. Then he remembered the mirrors and put his fancy down to some psychological effect of the multiplication of human masks. Prince Saradine distributed his social attentions between his guests with great gaiety and tact. Finding the detective of a sporting turn and eager to employ his holiday, he guided Flambeau and Flambeau's boat down to the best fishing spot in the stream, and was back in his own canoe in 20 minutes to join Father Brown in the library and plunge equally politely into the priest's more philosophic pleasures. He seemed to know a great deal both about the fishing and the books, though of these not the most edifying. He spoke 5 or 6 languages, though chiefly the slang of each. He had evidently lived in varied cities and very motley societies, for some of his cheerfulest stories were about gambling hells and opium dens, the Australian bushrangers or Italian brigands. Father Brown knew that the once celebrated Saladine had spent his last few years in almost ceaseless travel, but he had not guessed that the travels were so disreputable or so amusing. Indeed, with all his dignity of a man of the world, Prince Saradine radiated to such sensitive observers as the priest a certain atmosphere of the restless and even the unreliable. His face was fastidious, but his eye was wild. He had little nervous tricks, like a man shaken by drink or drugs, and he neither had nor professed to have his hand on the helm of household affairs. All these were left to the 2 old servants, especially to the butler, who was plainly the central pillar of the house. Mr. Paul, indeed, was not so much a butler as a sort of steward, or even chamberlain. He dined privately, but with almost as much pomp as his master. He was feared by all the servants, and he consulted with the prince decorously, but somewhat unbendingly, rather as if he were the prince's solicitor. The somber housekeeper was a mere shadow in comparison. Indeed, she seemed to efface herself and wait on the butler, and Brown had heard no more of those volcanic whispers which had half told him of the younger brother who blackmailed the elder. Whether the prince was really being thus bled by the absent captain, he could not be certain. But there was something insecure and secretive about Saradine that made the tale by no means incredible. When they went once more into the long hall with the windows and the mirrors, yellow evening was dropping over the waters and the willowy banks, and a bittern sounded in the distance, like an elf upon his dwarfish drum. The same singular sentiment of some sad and evil fairyland crossed the priest's mind again, like a grey cloud. "I wish Flambeau were back," he muttered. "Do you believe in doom?" asked the restless Prince Saradine suddenly. "No," answered his guest. "I believe in doomsday." The prince turned from the window and stared at him in a singular manner, his face in shadow against the sunset. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean that we here are on the wrong side of the tapestry," answered Father Brown. "The things that happen here do not seem to mean anything. They mean something somewhere else. Somewhere else retribution will come on the real offender. Here it often seems to fall on the wrong person." The prince made an inexplicable noise like an animal. In his shadowed face, the eyes were shining queerly. A new and shrewd thought exploded silently on the other's mind. Was there another meaning in Saradine's blend of brilliancy and abruptness? Was he perfectly sane? He was repeating, "The wrong person, the wrong person," many more times than was natural in a social exclamation. Then Father Brown awoke tardily to a second truth. In the mirrors before him, he could see the silent door standing open, and the silent Mr. Paul standing in it, with his usual pallid impassiveness. "I thought it better to announce at once," he said, with the same stiff respectfulness as of an old family lawyer. "A boat rowed by 6 men has come to the landing stage, and there's a gentleman sitting in the stern." "A boat?" repeated the prince. "A gentleman?" And he rose to his feet. There was a startled silence, punctuated only by the odd noise of the bird in the sedge, and then, before anyone could speak again, a new face and figure passed in profile round the 3 sunlit windows, as the prince had passed an hour or two before. But except for the accident that both outlines were aquiline, they had little in common. Instead of the new white topper of Saradine was a black one, of antiquated or foreign shape. Under it was a young and very solemn face, clean-shaven, blue about its resolute chin, and carrying a faint suggestion of the young Napoleon. The association was assisted by something old and odd about the whole get-up, as if of a man who had never troubled to change the fashions of his fathers. He had a shabby blue frock-coat, a red soldierly-looking waistcoat, and a kind of coarse white trousers common among the early Victorians, but strangely incongruous today. From all this odd clothes shop, his olive face stood out strangely young and monstrously sincere. "The deuce!" said Prince Saradine, and clapping on his white hat, he went to the front door himself, flinging it open on the sunset garden. By that time the newcomer and his followers were drawn up on the lawn like a small stage army. The 6 boatmen had pulled the boat well up on shore, and were guarding it almost menacingly, holding their oars erect like spears. They were swarthy men, and some of them wore earrings. But one of them stood forward beside the olive-faced young man in the red waistcoat, and carried a large black case of unfamiliar form. "Your name," said the young man, "is Saradine?" Saradine assented, rather negligently. The newcomer had dull, dog-like brown eyes, as different as possible from the restless and glittering gray eyes of the prince. But once again Father Brown was tortured with a sense of having seen somewhere a replica of the face, and once again he remembered the repetitions of the glass-paneled room, and put down the coincidence to that. "Confound this Crystal Palace," he muttered. "One sees everything too many times. It's like a dream." "If you are Prince Saradine," said the young man, "I may tell you that my name is Antonelli." "Antonelli," repeated the prince languidly. "Somehow I remember the name." "Permit me to present myself," said the young Italian. With his left hand, he politely took off his old-fashioned top hat. With his right, he caught Prince Saradine so ringingly a crack across the face that the white top hat rolled down the steps and on one of the blue flower pots, rocked upon its pedestal. The prince, whatever he was evidently not a coward. He sprang at his enemy's throat and almost bore him backward to the grass. But his enemy extricated himself with a singularly inappropriate air of hurried politeness. "That is all right," he said, panting in halting English. "I have insulted. I will give satisfaction. Marco, open the case." And I think we'll pause here and continue with this story in the next video. Please like, subscribe, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you guys. I love you. As Tigger says, ta-ta for now.